people committed evil. Now I wanted to write about why they did good. Studying the hearts and minds of local journalists who would risk certain death to get a story out gave me that opportunity. I began the book on World Press Freedom Day, 2005. The Committee to Protect Journalists in New York had just issued a bulletin which listed the 5 most murderous countries for journalists. In order of most killed since 2000, they were the Philippines, Iraq, Colombia, Bangladesh, and Russia. Now, while these countries had problems specific to their regions and cultures, I knew from my previous reporting that they were very similar in the way criminality was licensed and protected. Their political leaders acted like gang bosses. They appointed their supporters to bureaucracies with the understanding that while their salaries would be low, their incomes would be high. Corruption, which is an ad hoc arrangement in some places, was a formal structure in these nations. In return for support and the sharing of spoils, the leaders granted impunity to officials. Lawlessness occurred within the law, and a system identical to organized crime was locked into the business of the nations. The people were robbed, and the rulers got rich, and anyone who attempted to expose the rulers found out very quickly how organized crime could be. The murdered journalists also had similarities. Most worked low-paying jobs in remote areas. They exposed corrupt politicians or businessmen. Many were threatened with death by the people they'd exposed. And though a lot of them had predicted they would be murdered if they kept at their reporting, they persisted until the bloody end. I thought about those journalists a lot. They knew they would be killed. They kept at their word. And they were killed. Now, while the CPJ scrupulously reported all these murders, it was not in their mandate to offer portraits of the personal lives of the victims. There was almost nothing on the internet about them as individuals. I wondered who these amazing people were. What were their personal and psychological motivations, their inner lives, birth to death that led them to their last decision. To me, the psychological source of their courage was one of the most important questions I could ever address as a writer, a journalist, and a press freedom advocate. And so I chose representative cases in the 5 most murderous countries and set out to visit their hometowns, interview their families, colleagues, and if possible, the people who had ordered their murders. I had one question uppermost on my mind. What makes a local reporter stay on a story after being threatened with certain death? I started in Colombia, and I finished in Iraq. Naturally, there were a lot of unexpected events in the countries I visited. And tragically, one of those events involved the murder of a journalist I was scheduled to interview about 2 of her murdered colleagues. Her name was Anna Politkovskaya, and she was shot dead while I was in the air on my way to meet her in Moscow. Journalists were being murdered all the time while I was researching their countries, and I added victims to my list. In the end, I chose 7 journalists for full biography. They were all very different people, but they were the same in a couple of ways. They lived in towns where 3 or 6 or 20 or 80 of their colleagues had been murdered with impunity in the years before they themselves were murdered. And though they had predicted the consequences of their reporting, they persisted until their last breath. I'll give you cameo portraits of each and what they were up against, and then get to their complex inner lives and personal motivations. I began with an economics reporter in Columbia, the winner of Columbia's equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize. His name was Guillermo Bravo Vega, and his chief targets were the corrupt governor of his state and his cronies. All were untouchable because they were members of a hereditary clan known locally as the Yobitas Mafia. Bravo survived numerous assassination attempts and was ordered to get out of his town Neiva 6 times. The 7th order was delivered at his home by a hired paramilitary assassin. Bravo believed the federal police were in on the plot and told his colleagues, "This time they'll get it." He was so certain he would be killed that for the first time in his life he fled to Bogota. But he stayed away only 2 weeks. Against the advice of everyone, he returned to Neiva and his work. A few weeks later, he was in his bungalow working on a documentary about colleagues murdered by paramilitaries when, as he predicted, they got him. They shot him in the heart, the mouth, and the forehead. The message was clear. Don't feel this way. Don't talk this way. Don't think this way. In the Philippines, there was a mother of 4 named Marlene Garcia Espera. She lived in a small town on Mindanao, just a few kilometers from the site of the 2009 massacre. She was tormented by the problems her investigative journalism caused her children, particularly after a hand grenade destroyed her living room. Despite her fears for their safety, she continued to expose the theft of agricultural funds by federal officials, tracing the corruption right up to the cabinet secretaries of President Gloria Arroyo. It was that money which made its way into the pockets of those clan chiefs on Mindanao who swung the 2004 presidential election in Arroyo's favor. Near the end of her life, Espera sent President Arroyo a letter announcing, "I am ready to die for this cause." And, as she predicted, she did die, shot to death in her home in front of her children. Now, the journalism of both Espera and Bravo was filled with angry denunciations of corrupt officials, and that enraged their targets. But in Bangladesh, I examined the career of a shy and saint-like humanist who stuck calmly to the facts. Yet the strict facts offered him no protection. Manik Saha lived in a remote district dominated by Bengal mafia politicians who worked hand in glove with Islamic fanatics and Maoist rebels. They stole 500,000 acres from poor farmers, raped hundreds of Hindu farm wives, and logged within a preserve set aside for the Bengal tiger. After one of Saha's exposés, he told the press freedom advocate, "I am in danger. Anytime I can be killed." And as he predicted, he was killed, decapitated by a small bomb thrown at his head outside the press club. The manner of his execution sent a clear message to those in the press club who shared Saha's thinking. Likewise, the murder of Anna Politkovskaya the day I arrived in Moscow also sent a message. 2 of her colleagues at her Moscow newspaper Novaya Gazeta had been murdered